5 days after I started it, like the voices, it sounded like they were walking away from me. Like they just got so quiet. And then one day they were just gone. And, when the voices went away, the first thought I had was, I want them back.
Wyatt Forte has written a book called Those Not So Little Voices, describing the voices that he heard from the age of 6 in an honest way we three moms had never heard before. We speak with Wyatt and his mom about his road from adolescent psychosis to wellness and empowerment. Welcome to our podcast, Schizophrenia, Three Moms in the Trenches. From the place where schizophrenia and real life collide. East Coast, West Coast, Middle America. With Miriam Feldman, Mindy Greiling, and Randy Kay. We are so excited about this episode of Schizophrenia, Three Moms in the Trenches. Before I introduce our guests, I want to read a short paragraph from a book by Wyatt Forte, who, spoiler alert, is one of our guests, called Those Not So Little Voices. And this comes about, about a third or a quarter of a way into the book, where after hearing voices for many years, Wyatt finally decides to tell his mom. So he says, I called her over, and my mom says I had a look on my face she will never forget. I sat her down, took a big gulp, a deep breath, and told her, Mom, I have to tell you something. As I was saying this to her, the voices were screaming at me. Don't tell her. Don't you dare effing do it. He didn't say effing, but it's a podcast, so I just cleaned it up. But I knew what I had to do, and there was no turning back at this point. What is it, buddy? She replied. I hear voices, Mom. This is a conversation I, Randy Kay, have never had with my son. I don't even know if he knows he hears voices. And when I met our guests, Wyatt and his mom, Denise, this was the first time for me, after 20 years of dealing with schizophrenia in my son, 20 plus years, that I had, other than one memoir I read called The Day the Voices Stopped, that I had a sense of what the voices might be saying, because Wyatt is so open. So if you're on YouTube, you see them sitting here. Welcome, Wyatt and Denise Forte, mother and son duo. Full disclosure, I have mentioned this book in a couple of other episodes because I had the pleasure of moderating a panel for the American Psychiatric Association with you guys on it. If you are new to the podcast, I'm Randy Kay, author of Ben Behind His Voices. My son, who I call Ben for publicity purposes, not his real name, has had schizophrenia for 22 years, 25 years now, actually. So, Wyatt, I'd like you to meet Mindy Greiling.
Very nice to meet you.
Couple of
Nice to
decade
meet you.
state senator from Minnesota, whose book is Fix What You Can. Her son is Jim. And meet Miriam Feldman. We call her Mimi. Everyone calls her Mimi, except the cover of the book. And her book
Pleasure
is
to
He
meet
Came
you.
In With It. And her son, Nick, has schizophrenia. Guys, we are three moms. We're not doctors. We're doing what we can to turn pain to purpose with a podcast. And by the way, I just want to mention, for some reason this week, I got like 5 messages and emails out of the blue. Oh my God, I just discovered your podcast, because we don't like advertise or anything. So it's totally word of mouth. So when you spread the word about our podcast, you honor us so much with it. At this point, if you start to listen, this is episode 120. So, pick and choose unless you want to start from the beginning. Some people are doing that. But this episode is called Those Not So Little Voices, How I Found My Way from Adolescent Psychosis to Wellness and Empowerment. Wyatt and Denise, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I know you have a long story, and it's told in your book, which is available on Amazon. The link is showing up on your screen in YouTube and also in the show notes. Can you tell us a bit about the years that led up to that moment when you finally told your mom about the voices?
Yes. So that moment, that you were talking about from the excerpt in my book occurred in November of 2019. And I started hearing voices in May of 2011. So that was pretty much 8 years of my life when I was hearing voices and no one knew about it except for myself. Um, you know, since I heard voices for so long, it's certainly changed, as the years went on. But, in the early years of hearing voices, so probably somewhere around 2011, I remember just experiencing a lot of paranoia. And, the only reason I know that the voices started in 2011 is because I have a very specific memory of the day the voices started, which was sometime in May of 2011. But even before 2011, I certainly had symptoms of schizophrenia, just not the voices. I remember, as I said before, experiencing a lot of paranoia. When I was younger, I would walk into a room and just think that everyone was talking about me. And at first, it was a little interesting because it didn't really involve fear too much at that point. I would just think that people were talking about me, not necessarily negatively, just that everyone was talking about me.
And you were how old at this point? Right.
Uh,
That's just what I was wondering,
yeah.
to put a frame in it
So
here.
that was probably from ages 4 to 6, because when they started it in May of 2011, I was 6. So yeah, I was, very young. And obviously because I was so young, I don't have, too many clear memories, but I definitely remember just walking into rooms and thinking that, people I didn't even know, strangers, were talking about me. And then, in the early years of hearing the voices, again, it didn't involve too much fear. They were kind of just there. And what they would mostly do is kind of just comment on everything that I was doing. So it was almost like everything I did was spoken into by someone. So like for example, if me and my family were driving in the car, it would be, oh, look, they're all getting into the car now. And then, once I got in the car, it'd be, oh, now they're going to drive here and do this. Then when I would get out of the car, it was, oh, look, now he's going to get out of the car now and, walk into his grandma's house or, whatever it was that I was doing. And that scared me a little bit only because it felt like the voices were watching everything that I was doing and they knew everything that I was doing. So, that uncomfort or even just like fear was very, very annoying for me. But since it would happen so often, I kind of just got used to it. Um,
If
and
I can, like,
yeah, yeah,
just right now, like, so in this beginning period when he was 4 to 6,
right.
clearly I had no clue. And if anyone would have asked me, how is your 4 or 6 year old son? I mean, he was so well behaved. He did good in school, like even in, like pre-K and nursery. The only thing I could say with the benefit of 2020 hindsight, he was always very cerebral. Like you could always look at him and see that he was thinking. He was thinking about something. He almost, in every picture, that, his dad used to take hundreds of pictures of him. It always looked like he was looking someplace else, but the greatest photography pictures you could ever ask for. He was kind of like looking away or looking over here, or we would go to Disney and we would be waiting on lines at Disney and he would walk up to other families and just like look up at them and listen to them. And, but that was, I just thought he was being Wyatt. Like he was just, that's the kind of kid he was. Like some boys are very much into sports, very much, very active. He wasn't active. Everything was going on in his head. Like, so for the early years, there was not one sign that, if I'm being totally honest, that I could say, oh, I thought something was wrong. Go ahead,
Could
Bud.
I ask, I'm a former elementary teacher, and our son didn't start hearing voices till he was like probably 18 or 19 and was diagnosed when he was 21. But since then, I've talked to a lot of teachers. I used to focus on education in the Minnesota legislature. So I had, when I became public with our son's schizophrenia, I heard from a lot of teachers. And they said that even as young as like second grade, they could tell when their students were hearing voices because they'd become acclimated to the fact that some kids did. So did you have, I don't know how they could tell, I didn't ask, but one was a sixth grade teacher, and she said she could nail it when people like my son who weren't hearing voices yet, but did later, she could tell and almost always was right who was going to come down with serious mental illness when they were in sixth grade. Did you have any experience with any teachers who gave you any inkling of what was going on with Wyatt?
I don't believe so.
No, no. In
No.
fact, he was diagnosed, right, when he was just starting his first year of high school.
Right.
So he graduated grammar school, went to a very, very small grammar school, like probably 4 miles from our house. He
Yeah.
was the valedictorian. He was like the teacher's pet. I used to call him like Pope Wyatt. Everybody in this school loved him. And, you know, when he was diagnosed, like his eighth grade teacher visited him the first time he was hospitalized. And, you know, I went back to the school because his younger sister was two grade levels younger than him. So she was in the seventh grade when Wyatt was diagnosed. So when I went to parent teacher night for my daughter, you know, like I would talk to the principal and she was like, well, he wasn't having any of these issues when he was here, right? And I was like right now, like I'm in shell shock, lady. Like no, but he's telling me he's heard him since he's 6. So yeah, that would constitute when he was
Yeah.
here. But no, I can honestly say like none of it. I'm like his teachers, the administration, they were actually in shock and said like, you know, well, that wasn't going on here, right? And I was like, no, it actually was. I guess he just had very good coping mechanisms.
Right. And what I find interesting in reading your book, because you're so, in your hindsight, so honest about what was going on in your head. And you talk about certain incidents where you weren't that good in sports, but you tried. And, you know, I can say that my son was the same way. Like if he didn't do well in a sport, it was like everybody hates me instead of just like, oh, well, I'll try another one. So there are little things that wouldn't scream schizophrenia. They just scream a little anxiety. And Wyatt, it sounds like, and I know that you talk about that your voices were two distinct voices and that psychologically the form your voices took reminded you of the way your parents used to argue. And
Yes.
so, you know, we have learned as we educate ourselves that in different countries the voices manifest differently. But the fact is that the thing that really struck me when I met you is how many times they said to you, don't tell your mother or I will kill
Right.
your family.
Right. So, right. So when I first started hearing the voices, actually, I have a very clear memory of the day it started. So I was in my room and, I was sleeping and I woke up and I heard people talking. And, from what I know now, it was the two voices. And, at first I thought that like someone was at my bedroom door. So, I opened the door and like I looked out into the hallway to see if someone was there and, no one was there. And then, I was looking around my room trying to find who was talking to me. And then, I heard the voices and, they were like, what are you looking for, idiot? Like, what is he looking for? And then I had a weird realization and I thought to myself, there's no one in your room. And then, I heard the voices talking and, after they were like, what is he looking for? They were like, it's normal to hear voices. Like, don't tell your parents. And so, for the longest time, I just thought that it was normal and that everybody heard voices. So that's, I think that's why I didn't say anything when I was so young, because as I said, I was 6. So I think I was just like, a little boy doing what he was told. And, this is normal, don't say anything. So I kind of just thought that it was something that people didn't talk about. And, that was why I kept quiet for so long. And I didn't realize that there was something wrong with hearing voices until it was 2016.
Mhm.
So I was 11 at the point. And so, I have a very clear recollection of this as well. So it was me and my mom and my sister and my grandma. And, we went down into the city because my mom's sister, was diagnosed with schizophrenia as well. And I remember we were coming back from her apartment because we had been there earlier. And it was me, my mom, and my sister in the car, and I was in the passenger seat. And, my mom was telling us that, our aunt had schizophrenia and that she was hearing voices. And I remember I looked at my mom because I didn't say anything out loud, but like the look I gave her was like, what do you mean? Like, what do you mean she hears voices? Like, why are you telling me this? And then, after a couple seconds, it kind of clicked in my brain that something was wrong, abnormal with hearing voices, that it wasn't normal. And that was the first time the voices told me, if you say anything about this, we'll kill your family. Don't say anything. And then I remember for the rest of the car ride, I was just silent because I was thinking about it the whole time. Because basically, like what I had thought for 5 years, I realized wasn't true. And that was, I could say, the first time that the voices really caused me like true fear. And, when they told me that they were going to kill my family if I said anything, like, it wasn't even like a question in my brain. Like, I really thought that these voices had the power to kill my family if I did something.
Were the voices strangers? They say people are more apt to act on voices if they are recognizable voices as compared to strangers. What
Right.
were yours
So
people you recognized?
So, at first I didn't recognize the voice itself, but the voices, even when I first started hearing them, would fight a lot. And they would mimic the way that my parents would fight. So even though I didn't recognize the voice itself, they just seemed so familiar because of the way they fought. And then, like I said, just because I heard them for so long, like they became super familiar. And like, even now, I haven't been hearing voices for, I mean, a number of years, and I still remember the way they sounded, and I don't think that I'll ever forget that. So, like I said, when this incident happened, I'd already been hearing the voices for 5 years, all day, every day. They never stopped. So, they were super familiar at that point already, both the way they would fight, but then also just the voice itself, the voices themselves.
How did you get rid of them? And did you miss them in any way, shape,
Right.
or form?
So, like I said earlier, I finally told my mom about the voices in 2019. It was November of 2019. And that
And you
was,
were just tell us your age. You were like freshman in high school, right?
I was 14 and a half. Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah. So that's when I told my mom. And then, the day after that was the first time I was hospitalized. And from the time I was first
Excuse
hospitalized,
me, I just have to compliment your mom. That was fast
yes,
work. Good for you.
yeah,
Thank you. Thank you.
yes. Yeah, it was, I mean, it was very fast. I told my mom about it. I believe it was a Sunday night.
Yeah.
And then the following day was Veterans Day. And so, my mom brought me to her office with her. And then that night after she made, I mean, it seemed like 100 phone calls to me. Because I remember sitting in her office and she kept picking up the phone and calling people. Which, now I know was to see what she should do because she had no idea. But every time she picked up the phone, the voice was like, oh, who do you think she's calling? I wonder who she's calling. Is she talking about you? They're plotting to kill you because you told her. So, I mean, I remember sitting in her office and like almost crying every time she picked up the phone. And then, that evening, she brought me to the emergency room.
And
And
just parenthetically,
yes,
that was probably one of the worst days of my life,
yeah,
Um, he was petrified of his father. He
right,
thought his father was leading a society of people who were out to get him, and that, this anyone could be in the society.
right,
So, like me and his dad were divorced for a number of years at this point already, and our relationship is friendly enough. It's still amicable enough to this day, but he was like, you can't tell dad. You cannot. So I was totally in uncharted territory by myself with nobody to like, what do I do with my 14 and a half year old son? And half of the problem that I had was that he was 14 and a half, and there are not many resources for anyone under 16. And, they told me to take him to a local emergency room, which I did. And, that was like
right.
one of the last phone calls. And I mean, on my life, I don't know what I thought, but I didn't think they were going to admit him. And when I took him to the emergency room and the doctor came over and told me that they were going to admit him, and like the look in his face, like I don't know what I thought. Like I consider myself not a stupid person, but like I thought maybe give me some medicine and I could help him through this or work. But they were like, if you do not voluntarily admit him, I will involuntarily admit him.
You
Based,
are so lucky to have gotten that response and gone to that hospital because the early intervention is everything.
I
And I mean,
know.
I can't tell you how many times I brought my son hearing voices into hospitals and was sent home. So
Yeah,
that's really
Yeah.
wonderful that that went
Yeah.
there.
The doctor was, really understanding.
he was great. Yeah.
And, even, I mean, basically the whole time, no matter what was happening to me, I was almost always able to articulate what was happening. And, I was very clear to the doctor. I was like, this is, what's been going on. And, at this point, the voices had been screaming at me for about a day straight, nonstop. That, I wasn't allowed to tell anyone, that they're going to kill me if I keep talking. They're going to kill my mom if I keep talking. And I think at this point, I kind of just had the mindset of, well, if they're going to do it, it's already going to happen. So, I told this doctor and, he was super, he like looked at me and he was like, you can tell me what's going on. And then I told him, and, I remember he said, he was like, I almost feel like I'm talking to a colleague. He was like, I don't feel like I'm talking to a patient. Um,
That's
and yeah,
because it took you a while to get there. Obviously, you were a kid. You were a
yeah,
kid.
yeah,
But the fact that you knew you needed help
yeah,
was huge. And I know from our conversations that that was it. This isn't like, and then he went to the hospital and he was fine after that. Like you've had many,
no,
if we look at the book,
right,
there's like telling mom, then there's like the government, my next second hospitalization, like different hospitalizations. You also talked of something that I'd never heard of called Alice in Wonderland syndrome.
yeah,
And you had all olfactory hallucinations of,
yeah,
and then the voices were telling you something about food not to eat. Like,
yeah, yeah. So this is kind of what one of the more telltale signs. It was when I started high school. So, I live in Westchester and, I was admitted to like a very, very selective high school in New York City. And the commute was about an hour and a half each way. And I mean, as my mom said, I went to a middle school that was maybe 5 minutes away from my house, a car ride. So it was a really big change for me. And I just think that the amount of stress I was under made all of my symptoms so much worse. And, when I first started the high school, that was when things start to got really bad. And, the voices started telling me that if I ate anything, they would kill my mom. So I wasn't allowed to eat. And, it was, as I said, they'd kill my mom, or it was that the food was poisoned. And, I remember I used to like tell people, I remember I told my dad one time that, I think the food's poison. And he was like, well, look, like, what if I take a bite of it first and then show you that I'll be fine? And then the voices would tell me that the food was poisoned with a genetically engineered poison that could
Oh
only
my
kill.
goodness.
So it didn't matter if someone else took a bite of the food because the poison couldn't kill them. So, anyways, this probably started in September of 2019. And, I really didn't eat at all. In the morning, I would just not eat because I said that I wasn't hungry. At lunch, I just wouldn't eat either because I was at school, so no one was really watching me. But then, because after I stopped eating lunch for a while, I think my mom had said something to me. She was like, why aren't you buying lunch? And this was like the end of September. And so the voices told me you have to buy lunch and then throw it out. So your mom sees that you're spending money, so she doesn't know that you're not eating. So after that,
On
after
his high school account.
right. So, after my mom said that to me, like I said, probably the end of September, every day I would buy lunch and then throw it out as soon as I bought it. So she'd see
yeah,
that something was changing with my balance. And
that, yeah.
and
Go ahead,
sorry.
finish, and then
And for dinner, I would say that I wasn't hungry because I was studying. And then, I had lost like a significant amount of weight by the beginning of November. And then, because I was getting so hungry, I would tell the voices, okay, what if I just eat half? And that was like my compromise with the voices that, what I would eat for dinner, I could have half and only half.
Can I
So
ask you a quick question? When
yes,
you would, because like Randy, so many of us moms have the same thing where my son, I mean, my son's almost 40, and this has been going on for 20 years. And it's only in the last few years when he's been on clozapine that he's even admitted that he did hear voices, but
right.
he's very reluctant to discuss anything. So I'm just wondering, when you say, so I told the voices, did you speak out loud when you were talking back to them?
No, I would only speak in my head, and
Okay.
then they knew what I was saying, I guess, because it was me. But
Right.
yeah, no, I would never speak out loud to the voices. I would just think
Before
it.
before he told me about, that he was hearing
Oh,
voices, like
right.
when he graduated 8th grade, like when it was getting bad, but he was still managing, like I would see him like sometimes mumbling to himself.
Yeah,
Mhm.
But
because I think
and
sometimes when I
Yeah,
spoke to
we've
my
all had
head,
that one.
right,
I would
the
mouth
mumbling,
it,
yeah.
and it would kind of like come out audibly a little bit.
Yeah,
Mhm.
like, and like, like at his age, right? At that point, he was 14. So I just
Right.
thought he was like a moody teenager.
They're all crazy when they're
Right.
teenagers. I know. It's a
So,
very hard thing
was,
to, it's like,
but
yeah.
then you look back at it and you're like, no, he was like fighting with himself, literally.
Right.
But
Right.
that's so great.
Denise, could I ask you a question? Because Wyatt said your sister had
Sure.
schizophrenia. So my grandmother had schizophrenia, and still I did not apply, what her symptoms were to my son. But yet she also couldn't eat. Her voices told her she couldn't eat. Like she'd prepare this wonderful meal, and the rest of us, she said, go ahead and eat, but I can't. And then Jim also couldn't eat. His voices told him he couldn't eat. To me, getting thin, it's got to be for a lot of people a
Yeah.
symptom of schizophrenia. Jim was skin and bones when he was just diagnosed. But my grandmother's symptoms did not translate to me having a clue either about my son. And you said you didn't have a clue either about Wyatt. So are there any commonalities, or are you like me? You didn't learn a thing when you came to your own son.
Yeah, I mean, my sister, when right before her diagnosis, right before she told everybody, she got very, very thin. She was living with her husband down in the city, so I didn't see her that often. But she, you could definitely tell paranoia, like when I would speak to her. So there were some similarities, but and it's so hard to tell because this was my sister was just 50. She had just turned 50, so it was very late in her life. I was 46, she was 50. So and she was going through a tough time with her marriage. So a lot of the problems that she was having at that point, I just thought it was because she was going through a divorce, and she ultimately did get divorced, but she did confide to my aunt and myself later that year, December of 2016, that she hears voices, and they did the same thing, told her not to eat. But now, she's on medicine, thank God, and she's been fine since, probably the beginning of 2017. So, but no,
Yeah.
I guess it didn't click in my head seeing everything, with my son at that point, because it was different, I guess, or maybe I didn't want to see it,
Yeah, and in a minute I want to jump to the high school and quickly go through your setbacks and then jump to where you really did begin to get well because
Right.
why
It was
you're
a long
entering
journey.
NYU in the fall on
Yes.
full time, which is
Yes.
spectacular. Um, but I know it wasn't easy to get there, and you had some setbacks from
Yes.
having spoken to you. But I will say also, all of us in our books, you will see a similar. I mean, the foreword of your book is written by your 8th grade teacher,
Yes.
valedictorian. In fact, and my son too was like, oh, he's so bright. He's going to go to Yale Law School and support you. I mean, at 145 IQ, you passed the Johns Hopkins, got SAT grades like an 11th grader might, and very, very bright. But I don't how would any of us have known what was going on in his head when he would feel anxious? Like he might
Yeah.
have been hearing voices then. I don't know. And it was so normal to him that
Right.
he couldn't identify it. So, but I do know from NAMI Family to Family and all the books we've all read about schizophrenia that certainly stress and cannabis can trigger things that were just laying there.
Yeah.
So, for your sister to get schizophrenia so late and for your voices to represent the voices of the instability of your parents' marriage at that time, I think that's all normal, but it doesn't mean that stress will cause schizophrenia, but it can sometimes trigger it. So,
Yeah.
if you
Right.
could briefly get us through the setbacks in high school and what led you to Silver Hill and Clozaril.
Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah.
the Reader's Digest version, because they
I
can.
have figured,
Yeah.
I figured it had to be Clozaril if you're
Yeah.
doing so well.
And
Yes.
also Silver Hill, but there were some other
Yeah.
things you tried, and of course, in Wyatt's book you can get further details. But give us a brief version
Yes.
of what led you, and then what happened to really turn things around for you.
Sure. So, as I said, I was first hospitalized in November of 2019. I was only there for 3 days because, as soon as I was admitted into the hospital, the voices told me, you have to get out. Do anything you can to get out. Lie to them, act fine. You have to get out. So I got in. And, the first night they didn't, give me any medication because, I think they just wanted to observe me, without being on any medication. So the second night they, prescribed me a type of medication. And at first the voices were like, you can't take it, don't take it. And then, I was speaking to whoever the psychiatrist was in the facility. And, she kind of explained to me that, at this point, I did have the right to refuse taking the medication, but that if I did, they would give it to me against my will. So, I was kind of backed into a corner and I was really scared. And so I just took it. Like I remember just taking the pill out of their hands and swallowing it like as fast as I could. Then I went back to my room and because it was already late at this point. And, the voices told me, okay, do whatever you have to do to get out, or we're going to kill your mom and you're going to be in here. So there's nothing you can do. So the next morning I woke up and I remember I called my mom because they had like the payphone. So I called her and I remember like I tried to change my voice to sound like as happy and upbeat as I could. And I was like, "No, mom, like I'm really okay. Like I think that this medicine worked." I was like, "I can barely hear the voices. I think I'm okay." And I guess she just like obviously wanted to believe that.
Of course.
Oh, right, as I'm sure anyone would. So I remember she came to visit me that next day, that same day, like a couple hours later. And I was like, Mom, like I'm really okay. You have to get me out of here. And she was like, okay, okay. And I guess there was like a letter that she could write that, said that I had to be removed from this facility within, what was it, 72 hours,
72
48
hours,
hours,
yeah, something.
something like that. So she came and I was like, Mom, like, please write the letter. I'm okay. So she wrote the letter, and a day later, I was out. And so, they were then once I was out, the voices were like, good, like, okay, good. And then I was out, and then they were like, okay, you have to tell her that they're gone. Like, tell her that they're gone. So I was like, okay. So I told her, that the voices went away. And they didn't. And so, I kind of went back to the same high school, but it was getting very, very like almost impossible, I would say. Because to get down to the high school, I had to take the train there, then the subway back, and then the train home. And I remember when I would be standing on the train tracks, the voices would tell me to jump. And, it wasn't like, oh, you should jump. It was like screaming, like, do it, do it, do it, do it, do it. Like, it was like relentless for as long as I was standing on the tracks. And, I remember I would tell my friends, like, I would like, I'd be like, oh, guys, wait, because, we would be in Grand Central. And so, all of them would be like, okay, let's go find that track. And I'd be like, no, like, can we just wait in here for a little bit? And like, I would try and avoid the tracks for as long as I possibly could because it was like unbearable to stand there. And so that was kind of when I started telling my mom, like, Mom, like, I really want to transfer. Like, I think I should transfer. But I couldn't tell her that I wanted to transfer because the voices were telling me to jump, because at that point, she thought the voices were gone. So I was in like a very
It was a very,
difficult.
very frustrating
Yeah.
2.5 years. It was like playing the hokey pokey
Yeah.
with him. Voices are gone, voices are back, voices are gone, voices are back. And
Yeah.
like I was almost like and he went through a series of different medicines.
Right. Which,
And he's
that
very convincing. Like when he would tell me, like I would want to believe he's okay, but then I would see him struggling, and I would know like he's not okay.
yeah.
This is not okay. Like all of these medicines are not working because
Right.
he's only holding it together for so long until it happens again.
Right. And so I think that the event that made me tell my mom, like, look, I have to leave this school, was I was on the train and I was sitting down, and all of a sudden I was like towards the back of the train car, and all of a sudden I see from the front of the train car this woman like running towards me. And she looked like a really like old lady who like claimed to be homeless. Like she had like ripped clothes, like really long hair. She just looked like very dirty, and like she was carrying a knife. And like I remember she ran up to me, and she was like, they're gonna get you. And then she ran away. And that was the first time that I ever hallucinated something visually. Like it had always just been voices in my head. So, and at that point the voices had been going on for so long, so they were just like normal to me at that point. But now like visually seeing something like that really freaked me out. So that was when I told my mom. I was like, Mom, like I gotta go. And then we called my psychiatrist after that, and he was like, okay, yeah, like because I did confide in her about that.
But
um and he was like, okay, the medicine that I was on at that point, he was like, let's up it to, I believe I was on 10. He was like, let's go up to 20 milligrams.
that
And
wasn't the clozapine. That
no, no,
was,
no, that was
yeah, that was
one of the
something else.
first ones.
Yeah.
Yeah, because as
um
we've spoken about on this podcast
yeah,
a lot, they try everything before they'll try
they
that, and we're trying to change that.
I mean,
But
I think I went through probably 7 or 8 different antipsychotics before I was on clozapine.
I bet
Um,
when you were talking to the American Psychiatric Association, hopefully there were groans in the room. I hope those psychiatrists knew
well,
enough that they're,
I don't think this was about medications so much. Our panel was
right, we weren't allowed
but
to
who
name
was the
specific
audience? Was
medications.
it psychiatrists or families or?
it was psychiatrists. It was the
It was
American Psychiatric
psychiatrists. Okay,
Association.
well
Yeah,
then they should
The
know about meds and they should be
yeah,
groaning because they should know that their very own guideline says after 2 medication failures, go to clozapine. And there's
right.
even some people are now saying after 1 failure, go to clozapine. So I
yeah,
hope those psychiatrists realized that they have a ways to go when they heard your
Well,
story.
in general,
yeah,
but and we all tell our stories for different reasons. This panel was more to talk about caregiver support. We had a caregiver, we had Denise and Wyatt and me and a social worker on the panel
right,
talking about a continuum of care more than particular medications. But and if you're listening to the podcast for the first time, all of our sons, and now Wyatt as well, have had success with clozapine. Their best success. My son is currently not on it. That's his choice, which I don't agree with, but nothing I can do about it. But we are not saying that is the only medication.
right,
People
But I
have
will
to
say
find
when
what
my
works for
son
them.
was not, he was on it and then he had to go off because of erroneous diagnosis of neutropenia agranulocytosis. So for 16 years he wasn't on it. He's back on it now, thankfully. But in between there, he actually did listen to his voices and jumped off a building. So it's, I don't know, you must have huge resolve. I'm so glad you didn't do that. He's got a few, fused vertebrae and it just, changed
Wow.
a lot of
I had
things about his life. And so,
Wow, I
yeah,
had forgotten that. But, again, just so for our listeners, we are not sponsored by any pharmaceutical company. We're not sponsored by anybody. We're all just sharing our stories. It just
right,
happens to be for many of the people on the podcast that clozapine happens to work best for them. But
right.
Wyatt, let's jump to when you finally found clozapine, which I know has side effects for you.
Yes.
But believe it or not, it's like we're 45 minutes into this already. So
Oh,
I want to get I think Silver Hill was a turning point for you, or Clozapine was a
Yes.
turning point for you, and then what your life is like now. And then Denise, I want to also, I know you're jumping in as you feel, but if there's anything
Right.
else we're leaving out.
Yes.
So
Perfect.
So yeah, and then I was hospitalized in Silver Hill to the day a year later. And at this point I was still telling everyone that the voices were gone. And if things would get bad, I would say, oh, the voices came back. And then as soon as I did that a couple days later, it would be, oh, the voices were gone.
they were never gone at all. None of those meds did anything to the voices.
Never,
Not a
never.
thing.
And as I said, probably 7 or 8 different medications, and never once did the voices go away. If they would up the medication or change the medication, maybe like a visual hallucination would go away. So there was a period of time when, I had this delusion that the government was involved and the government was trying to kill me. And I would hallucinate to FBI agents. And so I was on a different medication after that happened, and that went away, but the voices never went away.
Okay. All
Um,
right.
so anyways, what kind of pushed me to, go to Silver Hill was this one experience that I had when, I told my psychologist, obviously at this point I said that the voices were gone, but I told my psychologist that I was feeling kind of suicidal. She thought that it was independent of the voices, but it was really because of the voices. And I guess she told my mom to, like, and everything in the house, like, take away the knives, anything sharp, and hide it. So she did that, but then I was taking a shower and I was using her shower at the time. And she didn't move the razor in the shower. And so I got in the shower and it was like the first thing that I saw. And, the voices were like, you should do it, just do it. And I told myself in my head, okay, I'm going to give it one more day. And if it's there tomorrow, then I'll do it. And so, whatever, the next day I went to school, I came back, and then I went to take a shower, and I looked in the shower and the razor was gone. So I guess she had realized that, she left the razor. And so she hid it. And, like, I remember, like, I walked into the bathroom, I shut the door, I locked it, I closed the windows. I saw it wasn't there. And then, like, I just got out of the shower and, like, started crying. And that was when I realized that I needed to go in the hospital and, like, really, like, get this under control.
And
And so, sorry.
we had reached out to Silver Hill like 2 or 3 days before that to see if they
Correct.
had a bed available. He
Correct.
was struggling so bad at this
Yeah.
point. And we were waiting for them to call us.
Yeah.
Right. So that morning, the morning between the 2 days, the two different showers that he took, I got in the, I was getting ready for work. I got in the shower and I saw the razor and I'm like, what an idiot. Like, I'm sitting here moving knives and this kid is showering in my shower with a razor here. So I just, got it and threw it out. And then he comes home. Right? I didn't say to him, I moved the razor. I just did it. And then he gets in the shower to take a shower. While he's in the shower, I got the phone call from Silver Hill that the bed was open. So he gets out of the shower and I told him, Silver Hill has a bed open. They can take you tomorrow. And he just started sobbing. And then he said to me, did you move the razor? And I was like, yeah, I moved it this morning, Wyatt. Why? And he was like, no, you didn't tell me.
No, I didn't.
He just said, oh, because I didn't see it there. And I was like, yeah, I'm sorry. I moved it because, of what Andrea said.
Right.
And so it was just very, very, very emotional,
Yeah.
the whole thing.
Yeah. And so then I went into Silver Hill and I was there for 11 days.
Yeah.
For 11 days. And, at this point, they didn't want to do clozapine yet either, even though, without exaggeration, there had probably been 8 other antipsychotics that had not worked. And they were like, okay, we're going to try a first generation antipsychotic in conjunction with a second generation antipsychotic, because she said sometimes that has very favorable results. And, they tried it, and I believe I said that it worked.
Yeah, you did.
Yes, I did. Because the voices again were like, you need to get out of here, get out of this hospital, or we're going to kill her. So I said it worked, and then I was released. And then, as I said, this was November because it was exactly almost a year after. And, I said the voices.
2020, so it was in the middle of COVID. I
Yeah.
could not visit him for 11 days. I used
Yeah.
to go
It was,
and stand in front of the window, me and his sister,
Yeah.
wave
yeah.
to him.
Yeah, because they couldn't come in. Um, And so I was released, and I said that the voices were gone, and they weren't. And then everything, I kind of kept under control until December. And then, I had a fight with my dad that was really bad. And I think that was what like really like pushed it over the edge. And like, I remember because we have a house in the Jersey Shore. And like, I remember I was sitting in bed and I just heard people running. Like it sounded like they were running all over the house. And then we went home and then I had a visual hallucination of like this girl who like, if you ever seen the movie like The Ring, and she looked just like, Samara from The Ring. And, she would follow me around. And that was just like really disturbing to see
This
visually.
is,
Um,
well, I mean, honestly, I don't know if my son will ever be as honest about,
yeah,
as you are. It gives me, it makes me cry for my son, what he's probably keeping secret from
yeah,
himself and from me. Um, we have about just 5 minutes left, so I want to make sure
yes,
we so relate to the hospitalization again and again, the different meds. When you finally were prescribed Clozaril,
right.
could you feel a difference, and what is your life like now?
Yes. So, I was prescribed the Clozaril maybe 2 weeks after that, incident that I just described because, my psychiatrist was like, he's been suffering for too long. So, they prescribed it and, he did advise that it would make me really, really tired. But at that point, I accepted that I wanted help and I didn't care. So I started the Clozaril and I mean, 5 days after I started it, like the voices, it sounded like they were walking away from me. Like they just got so quiet. And then one day they were just gone. And I'm not even exaggerating, maybe 6 or 7 days after I started it. And when the voices went away, the first thought I had was, I want them back. Because at that point I'd been hearing them, I mean, every day for
10 years, right?
10, 11 years, probably. And
Yeah.
not a day in my life did I not hear them for 11 years. So it was weird and I wanted them back. But, I had already been seeing my psychologist for a really long time at that point. So we had a great relationship. And, she helped me work through that. And, I've gotten to a point now where I don't know, it's something that I'll never forget. And sometimes like if I'm hard on myself or I fail at something or don't do good at something, I'll think about what the voices would have said and I'll almost hear it in my head. If I don't do something right or whatever, it's almost like I can hear them again, but I don't. Um, and yeah, I just really feel like a completely different person. Like it felt like I was like set free because the voices would like control everything about my life, and it just finally felt like I was in control of everything about my life.
Wow.
Besides medication, could you, for, most of us haven't been to Silver Hill, what did they do there besides meds that you think helped you the most?
Yeah. So, they did a lot of group therapies, which I think really helped. And like, when I say therapies, it wasn't really like therapy. It was like, they would do like art therapy or like music therapy, or, they would like let us watch TV. So I think the therapies they had were just to like get our mind off of what was happening. So like, keeping us busy because like, instead of just like sitting in the hospital thinking about what's happening to you and think about what are they going to do, are they going to change my medicine, are they going to like send in a new therapist to talk to me? So I think just like getting our minds off of it a little
Did
bit,
you
which
interact with other patients at that point? Did you
yeah.
talk? And did other people talk about the voices?
Well, I met this other girl who, she was there and she wasn't hearing that she said to me she wasn't hearing voices yet, but she, like, I remember we came up from lunch and we were all sitting on the couch, and like she looked at everyone else, and she was like, why were you guys talking about me? And everybody else was like, what are you talking about? But like, I mean, you should have seen the look on my face, because I knew. And then I remember she had seen the psychiatrist, and like she came up to me, because like I was like comforting her. I was like, no, like, and I didn't tell her. I was like, no, we're not. I was like, why do you think that? Like just like letting her talk. And she came up to me the next day, and she was like, they're talking about paranoid schizophrenia. And all I told her was like, I was just like, listen to them. And I'd like, not in a do what you're told sort of listen to, just like hear them out.
Hear them
And
out.
I
Yeah.
remember like maybe a year later, like I saw her, like I found her on Instagram, and like her profile picture was like a picture of her smiling. And like I remember I said to my mom, I was like, that's the first time I've ever seen her smile.
Ah.
And like it made me so happy.
Wow. So
Nice.
Wyatt, you shared with me that you sleep. Your way of coping with the side effects of Clozaril is just knowing that you need sleep. And how many hours of sleep do you need a night?
I mean, anywhere from like 13 to 15. No matter, even if I don't do anything that day, 13 to 15.
And
That's the same as my son. So you're smart to know you need it and to get it and not feel guilty about it, I hope.
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah. So
It,
when you go to college in the fall, you're arranging your classes around your need for your health.
right. Exactly. So, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, my classes start at 2:30, and Tuesday, Thursday, my classes start at 6:30. So, I spoke to like the disability services, and, some schools are less understanding, some schools are more understanding. Um, Thankfully, NYU was super understanding, so it was pretty easy.
That's amazing. So I'm going to ask each of you. Let me go to you, Denise.
Yeah.
So I think all four moms here have a lot in common. And what is there anything you would like other moms to, or dads, or loved ones? You're also a sibling. Is there anything you would like people to know about your experience? Things you wish you had known, things you wish you had done differently, or things that are helping you cope now? I know that's a broad question.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I guess just to like pick one aspect of it is, you know, when you're in the thick of things, like you really just need to compartmentalize like what needs to be done first, because it is so easy to get overwhelmed. And, that's exactly what happened to me, because I really didn't have any background. Even with my sister, it still really didn't prepare me to try to help my son, right? And you just have to compartmentalize things, take things one day at a time, and try to get the help, try to get the support. um with the school and the accommodations, there's always that tension between, do you ask, you use it, you don't want to use it as a crutch, but you need every single accommodation, because everyone's needs are unique, right? And there's a certain amount of support that someone, who is diagnosed with schizophrenia needs, and they need that, no matter, how minute it is or how extensive the accommodation is. They need that to sustain and to be viable. So, and just for anyone who has a loved one that's under the age 16, you have to be your own best advocate, because there's not a lot of resources for children under 16. The early intervention is key. So you really have to be, cognizant of things, like listen to your adolescents, listen to your preteens when they talk, because you don't want to be, overbearing, but just look for signs, because 9 times out of 10, if something is going to happen, they're there before, you just don't see them. You just overlook them.
Awesome. Thank you. And Wyatt?
Yeah, I think my biggest piece of advice is, if you get a diagnosis like schizophrenia, really at any age, but especially if you're young, like I was, it's not the end of the world. It's not a death sentence, because that is certainly what I thought. When I was 14 and a half, alone in a room with four doctors who told me that I had schizophrenia. I mean, I thought that my life was over, that I would never be able to go to college or like get a good job. And, I proved that wrong myself. And, really anyone can do that. So don't let like the fear consume you and, limit you, because it shouldn't.
I love that.
I love that too. Mimi, any last? You've been nodding your head the whole time, so
And you're muted, Mimi. You're muted.
There we go. It's just been reverberating in my head a couple things. One thing is when Nick was little, everybody used to call him the judge because he was quiet and so thoughtful and not rambunctious and risk-taking like little boys usually are. And he just, he would sit and he would just take in and I wonder about the voices, the last time or the time that just haunts me so much is when he was about 15, and this was before we even knew mental health was an issue. And he was upset because he had broken up with a girlfriend, and I went in to talk to him and we talked about it and I gave him advice. And then as we were sort of finishing up the conversation and I was leaving the room, he said to me, Mom, I just have these voices in my head. And, I, again, had no reference to mental illness, schizophrenia, anything. And I sat him down and I told him, look, we all have weird thoughts. We all think of odd things. The perfect answer for a kid who wasn't developing. I said, what matters is what you do, not what you think. Don't beat yourself up about weird thoughts. And I gave him this great pep talk about it and walked away. And I think back to that, and it was like, oh my God, it was like a voice from the other side warning me, and I didn't know enough to take it seriously. Here's a boy developing a thought disorder. And I told him, don't worry about your thoughts, they don't count, and walked out of the room.
Because you didn't
unlike
know.
you, Randy, when I'm on the verge of tears just listening to this.
Yeah.
It's so painful and so recognizable to me, and we don't have at the time the knowledge to address these things. Like that was my chance to address it when he was 15. He didn't get diagnosed till he was 20.
Right. And there's so much shame. There's so much shame and stigma, not only from the outside world, but as Wyatt has shared with us today, your own voice is giving you stigma, right?
Yeah.
So,
It's heartbreaking.
I'm really going to recommend that if you want kind of a really raw, honest inside look at what it feels like to hear voices, the book is called, just look those Not So Little Voices. You can get it on Amazon. Search for it, or the link is in our show notes. Wyatt and Denise, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. It was a pleasure being with
Yeah.
us.
Thank you so much for tuning into this episode of Schizophrenia, Three Moms in the Trenches. You can help out the podcast and help others by sharing the podcast and by subscribing wherever you get your podcasts and or on YouTube. And remember, you can reach us at mindygreiling.com, randyk.com, or miriam-feldman.com.